everyone, it's Monique, and today I want to share some of the mnemonics that I came up with for some of the DSM-5 differential diagnoses. This has helped me, and I'm hoping that it can help others as well. So first, you should know that some of the wording might be awkward. As I mentioned, this was really made for myself. So some of the wording might be awkward. Also, some of the disorders are kind of clumped together. So like bipolar and depressive disorders, often referred to as mood disorders, and schizophrenic and other psychotic disorders may be shortened to just like psychotic disorders or something like that. Also, some of the common sense diagnoses that you would expect to see with certain differentials, like substance and medication related disorders, as well as other medical conditions and other mental conditions, they might just be omitted from the list. Like, if we know, we know, right? And then also, some of the secondary symptoms might be highlighted a little bit more than like the dominant symptoms that we'll see like presenting in a client. So first we have our psychotic disorders. These disorders are the ones that I'm highlighting here are going to be delusional disorder, brief psychotic disorder, schizophreniform disorder, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective disorder. So when I think of delusional disorder, I'm thinking of somebody who's like super suspicious and they kind of present as odd. So the mnemonic that I came up with was she seems to be more suspicious and odd. So the S would be for schizophrenia, the other S for schizoaffective, the B for bipolar disorders, M for major neurocognitive disorder, S for schizophreniform disorder, O for obsessive compulsive related disorders, D for delirium, and D for depressive disorders. The next one is brief psychotic disorder. And if you guys remember, brief psychotic disorder is when you're really in like the beginning phases of psychosis and things like that. And so it lasts for under a month. So I said formation of believable psychotic symptoms of minute duration. So the F is for factitious disorder, the O, other medical conditions, B, bipolar disorders, P, personality disorders, the S is for substance related disorders, the other O is for other psychotic disorders, the M is for malingering, and the D is for depressive disorders. For schizophreniform disorder, we know that this is like when you're in the process of forming into schizophrenia, like most patients end up transitioning into schizophrenia. And we know that this lasts between that 1 month and that 6-month mark. So I wrote becoming other stuff. So that's all I had. So we have is B for brief psychotic disorder and O for mental disorders and medical conditions. And if you would like to look at the schizophrenia differential diagnoses, what I did was I kind of looked at the fact that it lasts 6 months, and it really is like those psychotic symptoms. So I have 6 months of psychotic sensory beliefs and delusions seductively calling out. So the S is for schizoaffective disorder. The M is for mood disorders with psychotic or catatonic features. The O is for obsessive compulsive disorders. The P is for post-traumatic stress disorders. The other S is going to be for schizotypal personality disorder. The B is going to be for brief psychotic disorder. The A is with autism spectrum disorder. The D is delusional disorder. Another S for schizophreniform disorder. C for communication disorder. And O for other mental disorders associated with psychotic disorder. And last up on this list, we have schizoaffective disorders. And if you guys remember, schizoaffective disorder is like mood disorder had a baby with psychotic disorders, right? So I have other psychotic mood syndrome. So O is for other mental disorders and medical conditions. P is for psychotic disorders due to another medical condition. M is for mood disorders. S is for schizophrenia. And that's the last of the schizoaffective disorders, so we can move right on into bipolar and related disorders. So within this category, I have bipolar 1 disorder, bipolar 2 disorder, and cyclothymic disorder. So if you guys remember, bipolar 1 disorder is characterized by like those manic episodes, right? So I have pessimism offsetting persistent grandiosity and mania over a prominent duration. And so we have P for personality disorders, O for anxiety disorders, another P for post-traumatic stress disorders, G for generalized anxiety disorders, A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, M for major depressive disorder, O for bipolar disorder, P for panic disorder, D for disorders with prominent irritability. Next up, we have bipolar 2, and this one was really hard, so I ended up using a Spanish word. So with bipolar 2, you can remember it's not as like the mania isn't as prominent. In fact, it's hypomania, right? And so I really tried to get creative with this one because I struggled with this one. So I have quattro submania presentations offsetting anhedonia and sadness. So you can see there where I really kind of forced it. So like when we think of 4, because we know that we need about 3 or 4 to be like hypomania, and even like that 4-day duration, like that half of the week. I have the C for cyclothymic disorder, and the S for substance use disorder, M for major depression disorder, P for personality disorders, O for other bipolar disorder, A for anxiety disorders, another A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and another S for schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And last within this category, we have cyclothymic disorder. And you guys know that this is kind of like a shift that we see between almost kind of like bipolar symptoms, but they're just a little bit less, right, on that spectrum. So I have brief shifts between bipolar symptoms with a bountiful duration because they also last for a little bit, like I think you need like a 2-year duration. So there's that. B is for bipolar disorder due to another medical condition. S is for substance/medication induced bipolar disorders. B is for bipolar 1 disorder with rapid cycling. The other B is for bipolar 2 disorder with rapid cycling. S is for substance medication induced depressive disorder. B is for borderline personality disorder. D is for depressive disorder due to another medical condition. So next up we have the depressive disorders, and here I highlighted the disruptive mood regulation disorder, major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So next up we have disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And if you guys remember correctly, that this disorder is characterized by like a lot of mood shifts and things like that, but also feeling like getting disproportionately upset or being bothered by something that most of us aren't going to be that upset by, right? So I have always massively bothered over insignificant acts and affairs. So for the first A, we have autism spectrum disorders. The M is major depressive disorder. The B is bipolar disorders. O, oppositional defiant disorder. I, intermittent explosive disorder. Another A for anxiety disorders. And the last A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. For this one, we're going to go over major depressive disorder. And if you guys remember, so again, I'm running out of English words. So I use a little bit of French, which I use semaine, which is a week, right? And so if you guys remember, this is like when you're super depressed and it lasts for like 2 weeks, right? At least 2 weeks. So I have the second semaine of sad, miserable, anti-motivated anhedonia. So the S is for sadness. The S The next S is for substance or medication-induced depressive disorder. The next S is for substance or medication-induced bipolar disorder. And M for manic episodes with irritable mood or mixed episodes. The A is for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The M is for mood disorder due to another medical condition. And an A for adjustment disorder with depression. So next we have persistent depressive disorder. And if you guys remember, this is a very persistent type of depression. It lasts a minimum of 2 years. A lot of mood stuff, not really feeling great, right? Stuff like that. So here I have being persistent with self-depreciation with simultaneous mood projection. Okay. So B is for bipolar disorders related to another medical condition. P is for psychotic disorders. S is for substance, medication-induced depressive disorder. D is for depressive disorders related to another medical condition. S is for substance and medication-induced bipolar disorder. M is for major depressive disorder. And P is for personality disorders. So next up we have premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And if you guys remember, this is when you have really sucky period symptoms that start a little too early or last a little too long for the DSM-5's liking, right? So we have having bad moods and projecting during periods, because remember, this is a very extreme symptoms, right? So H, we have hormonal treatment use. B, bipolar disorder. The M is for major depressive disorder. The P is for premenstrual syndrome. And the D is for dysmenorrhea. The P is for persistent depressive disorder. Okay. And next up, we have anxiety disorder. So for the anxiety disorders, we're going to look at separation anxiety disorder, selective mutism, specific phobia, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, agoraphobia, and generalized anxiety disorder. So first up, we have separation anxiety disorder. And if you guys remember, this is when people don't want to separate from their caregiver or just another person who they feel really connected to. And it causes them it's distressful. It causes them pain and distress. So I have persistently obsessing about getting separated from partner, i.e. bestie, BF as in boyfriend, parent, causing pain and distress. Okay? So we have the P for panic disorder, the O for oppositional defiant disorder, the A for agoraphobia, G for generalized anxiety disorder, S for social anxiety disorder, P for psychotic disorder, I for illness anxiety disorder, B for bipolar disorders, another B for bereavement, another P for personality disorders, C for conduct disorder, P for post-traumatic stress disorder, D for depressive disorders. So we're also going to look at selective mutism. Remember, this is when people are not communicating in more than one setting that they should be expected to communicate in, right? So we have problems communicating that's not specific. That's all I had. So the P is for psychotic disorder. The C is for communication disorders. We have an N for neurodevelopmental disorders, an S for social anxiety disorder. So we also have specific phobia, right? And we know that this is when people typically get or scared over things that really, really scared, and it's an irrational fear over things that other people might not, like puppies or feathers or planes, right? So I have always so scared over things plenty of people enjoy or endure. So we have A for agoraphobia, S for social anxiety disorder, S for separation anxiety disorder, O for obsessive compulsive disorder, T for trauma and stressor related disorders, P for psychotic disorders, P for panic disorders, and E for eating disorders. So here we have social anxiety disorders. And this is where people are super nervous about being negatively evaluated by other people. And so it makes social interactions really kind of impossible, right? So we have the thing I came up with was persistently staying away over negative assessments or social punishments made by others during social gatherings. Whew, that was a mouthful. So, P, panic disorder. S, separation anxiety disorder. We have an A for agoraphobia, an O for oppositional defiant disorder, N for normative shyness, A for autism spectrum disorder, an O for other mental disorders, another S for specific phobia, another P for personality disorders, an M for major depressive disorder, a B for body dysmorphic disorder, another O for other medical conditions, D for delusional disorder, an S for selective mutism, a G for generalized anxiety disorder. And so we're also going to look at panic disorder. And remember that panic disorder is when people are when they have these panic attacks, right? And they really kind of are hyper focused on, oh my goodness, I want to keep this from happening. But these attacks are kind of surprise and they kind of just happen, right? So what I have is utterly obsessing over surprise attack. So U is for unspecified anxiety disorder. O is for other specified anxiety disorders. O is for other mental disorders with panic attacks as an associated feature. S is for substance or medication-induced anxiety disorder. A is for anxiety disorder due to another medical condition. So here we are with agoraphobia. And remember, the criteria for agoraphobia speaks to staying out of like places where one feels like they can't escape, or they might not be safe, or they can't get back to where they want to go. And this has to happen in a couple of settings. But sometimes we'll see it in like the public, like subways or at schools, or, and people typically will stay home. So I have protectively staying out of public markets, streets, and subways. So the P is for panic disorder. The S is for specific phobia. O is for other medical conditions. P is for post-traumatic stress disorder. The M is for major depressive disorder. There's an S for separation anxiety, an A for acute stress disorder, and then the last S is for social anxiety disorder. So next up we have generalized anxiety disorder. And if you guys remember, generalized anxiety disorder is when people are just kind of anxious about all types of stuff, right? Like a broad spectrum of stuff. So I have anxiously dreading and sulking in public over plenty of broad subjects. So we have an A for anxiety due to another medical condition, D for depressive disorders, A for adjustment disorder, S for substance/medication-induced anxiety disorder, P for post-traumatic stress disorder, O for obsessive-compulsive disorder, P for psychotic disorder, and B for bipolar disorders, and lastly, S for social anxiety disorder. So for obsessive compulsive disorder, we know that this is characterized by having these obsessions and compulsions, or both. But we know that usually people will have the obsessions and the compulsions will kind of alleviate that. So they're kind of constantly kind of obsessing over that, right? So I have often excessively thinking about methods to obstruct persistent obsessions. And so the O is for obsessive compulsive personality disorder. The E is for eating disorders. The T is for tics and stereotyped movements. The A is for anxiety disorders. The M is for major depressive disorder. Another O for other compulsive-like behaviors. A P for psychotic disorder. Another O for other obsessive and compulsive and related disorders. So with body dysmorphic disorder, we know that people typically will look in the mirror and they'll see someone who looks completely different from what the outside world sees, right? And so this is something that's their perception, and it's usually like a flaw, right? So I have a never-ending altered perception of one's monstrous image. So the N is for normal appearance concerns and clearly noticeable physical defects. The E is for eating disorder, an A for anxiety disorders, a P for psychotic disorders, O for other obsessive compulsive related disorders, another O for other disorders and symptoms, an M for major depressive disorder, and an I for illness anxiety disorder. So next up we have hoarding disorder. And remember, this is when people need to possess things, right? And there's like an emotional attachment to these things, right? So I have need to possess or monitor numerous objects. So the N is for neurodevelopmental disorders. The P is for psychotic disorders. We have an O for obsessive compulsive disorder. M is for major depressive episodes. N is for neurocognitive disorders. And the last O is going to be for other medical conditions. So if you guys remember, trichotillomania is characterized by like anxiously pulling out your hair and not necessarily having much control over it, right? So we have nervously pulling out numerous afro strands. So we have an N for normative hair removal or manipulation, a P for psychotic disorders, an O for other obsessive compulsive and related disorders, another N for neurodevelopmental disorders, an A for another medical condition, and S for substance related disorders. And here we have excoriation disorder. And remember, this is when people will skin, they'll pick their skin, right? And typically have developed scabs and sometimes even infections. And it's something like trichotillomania where they're not necessarily in control and it causes anxiety and things like that, right? And also stems from anxiety. So we have nervously obsessing over picking one's skin and scabs. So the N is going to be for neurodevelopmental disorders. The O is for other medical conditions. We have another O for other disorders, a P for psychotic disorders, another O for other obsessive compulsive and related disorders, and an S for somatic symptom and related disorders, and the last S is going to be for substance medication induced disorders. So next we're going to look at some trauma and stressor related disorders. Here we have reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, and adjustment disorder. So when we're looking at reactive attachment disorder, remember this is characterized by like usually in children where they kind of are indifferent or not really giving too much attention to their caregivers, right? There's a certain detachment associated with it, right? And so I have detached indifference with adults. So the D is for depressive disorders. The I is for intellectual disability. The A is for autism spectrum disorder. Now let's go over post-traumatic stress disorder. And we know that PTSD is after somebody goes through something traumatic, they will typically have like these almost kind of like flashbacks and obsessions and things like that. Like it can get really like the anxiety can be really high and depression associated with it and things like that. So I have assiduous, debilitating obsessions causing mental and physical problems over atrocious trauma. Whew. So, the A is for adjustment disorders, a D for dissociative disorders, an O for obsessive compulsive disorder, a C for conversion disorder, an M for major depressive disorder, an A for acute stress disorder, a P for personality disorder, another P for psychotic disorder, another O for other post-traumatic disorders, another A for anxiety disorders, and lastly a T for traumatic brain injury. So when we look at acute stress disorder, remember this is kind of like PTSD, except it's for a shorter duration, like it's acute, right? So here we have acute duration of PTSD presentations post-trauma. So the A, adjustment disorders, D, dissociative disorders, O, obsessive compulsive disorder, P, panic disorder, another P for post-traumatic stress disorder, another P for psychotic disorder, and a T for traumatic brain injury. The next category we're looking at is disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. And so the disorders that we'll be looking at here are oppositional defiant disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, conduct disorder, pyromania, and kleptomania. So let's look at oppositional defiant disorder. We know that ODD, you need to have like a 6-month duration of being kind of moody and irritable and all that, and have problems following rules and with authority. And so I have 6 months duration of constant irritability and listening issues. So the S is for social anxiety disorder. We have an M for mood disorder, a D for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, a C for conduct disorder, an I for intermittent explosive disorder, an A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, an L for language disorder, and an I for intellectual disability. All right, so next up we have intermittent explosive disorder. And if you guys remember, this disorder is characterized by being kind of very upset and getting disproportionately upset about things that we might not all get upset about. Like your average person might not get upset about it, and it might be explosive in a sense of like outbursts and things like that. So I have always being disproportionately mad and constantly displaying outbursts about petty stuff. So we have an A for antisocial personality disorder, a B for borderline personality disorder, a D for delirium, an M for major neurocognitive disorder, another A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a C for conduct disorder, another D for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, an O for oppositional defiant disorder, an A for autism spectrum disorder, a P for personality change due to another medical condition, and an S for substance intoxication or withdrawal. So now let's look at conduct disorder. And keep in mind, conduct disorder is when we see a lot of like aggression and a lot of like property damage, like stuff like that, right? And so we have disturbing behaviors involving acts of aggression. So I have D for depressive disorders, B for bipolar disorders, and I for intermittent explosive disorders, and A for adjustment disorder, an O for oppositional defiant disorder, and another A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So here we have pyromania, and if you guys remember, this is characterized by like that tension and release associated with like fires, whether we have fire setting, being around it, the smell of fire, things like that. So I have obsessing over fire. And we have 2 O's. So the first one is for other causes of intentional fire setting, and the last one is other mental disorders. Let's go over kleptomania. Keep in mind that kleptomania, like pyromania, has that whole tension and release factor associated with it, right? And also, people who are engaging in these acts are typically stealing things, and they don't necessarily need them or are stealing for an obvious external cost, right, or purpose. And so we have many methodical acts of criminally obtaining meaningless products. So we have the first M for malingering, another M for manic episodes, an A for antisocial personality disorder, a C for conduct disorder, an O for ordinary theft, an A for major neurocognitive disorder, and a P for psychotic episodes. Now let's go over some of the dissociative disorders. So we'll be going over dissociative identity disorder, dissociative amnesia, depersonalization, and derealization disorder. So here we have dissociative identity disorder. And keep in mind that this is when someone goes through something traumatic typically, and they end up formulating these multiple personalities within like their mind and their body. And so we have a post situation causing multiple personalities, stimulating one person's mind and body functioning. So we have a P for post-traumatic stress disorder, an S for substance medication-induced disorder, a C for conversion disorder, an M for major depressive disorder, a another P for psychotic disorder, another S for seizure disorders, an O for other specified dissociative disorder, another P for personality disorder, and another M for malingering, and a B for bipolar disorder, and lastly an F for factitious disorder. So again, the dissociative disorders are typically like born out of trauma. And so with dissociative amnesia, this is when someone has like memory problems, usually towards a specific event or something like that. But we have forming severe memory problems caused by something disturbing, negative, and not pleasurable. So an F for factitious disorder, S for seizure disorders, M for malingering, a P for post-traumatic stress disorder, a C for catatonic stupor, an S for substance-related disorders, a D for dissociative identity disorder, an N for neurocognitive disorder, another N for normal and age-related changes in memory, and lastly, a P for post-traumatic amnesia due to brain injury. Last in this category, we're going to look at depersonalization, derealization disorder. And keep in mind that this is when people have like they're kind of short term, but like lapses in like their presence. So like almost kind of experiencing like out of body experiences, or feeling like you're in a fog or something like that, but you know it. Like you're not like you're very aware of like, whoa, something ain't right? So we have momentary issues attaching to one's present and self that's made obvious. So we have M for major depressive disorder, I for illness anxiety disorder, and A for anxiety disorder, O for obsessive compulsive disorder, P for psychotic disorder, S for substance medication induced disorder, another M for mental disorder due to another medical condition, and an O for other dissociative disorders. So with the next category, we're going to look at some somatic symptom related disorders. So we're going to look at somatic symptom disorder, illness anxiety disorder, conversion disorder, and factitious disorder. So let's look at somatic symptom disorder. And if you guys remember, this is when people are experiencing some type of like body pains or somatic symptoms, and it causes a lot of anxiety within them, and a lot of like being fixated on it, and because it's not something that the doctors can find something going on with them and things like that, it typically will disrupt like their life function, right? So we have individuals obsessing over body pains, causing general duty disruption. So we have an I for illness anxiety disorder, an O for obsessive compulsive disorder, another O for other medical conditions, a B for body dysmorphic disorder, a P for panic disorder, a C for conversion disorder, a G for generalized anxiety disorder, a D for depressive disorders, and a D for delusional disorder. Okay, so let's go over illness anxiety disorder. And keep in mind, this is when people typically become very, very anxious about either having or getting some type of sickness. Usually there are no symptoms, or sometimes there might even be some like really like limited or mild somatic problems or something like that. But they become really fixated and anxiety provoking over these issues. So we have obsessively anxious about obscure or mild somatic problems. So the first O is for obsessive compulsive and related disorders. We have an A for adjustment disorders, another A for anxiety disorders, another O for other medical conditions, an M for major depressive disorder, an M for somatic symptom disorder, a P for psychotic disorders. Let's look at conversion disorder now. Remember, this is when people are they usually will go through something traumatic. Not all the time anymore, but that used to be a requirement. But they'll go through something usually and lose some type of either sensory or motor functioning. But there's no like um, physical cause, no physiological cause that the doctors can find. So I have problems demonstrating motor or sensory functioning that no doctors believe. So for the P, we have panic disorder. There's a D for dissociative disorders. We have M for malingering, S for somatic symptom disorder, F for factitious disorder, N for neurological disease, D for depressive disorders, and lastly, B for body dysmorphic disorder. So next we're going to go over the feeding and eating disorders. So we'll go over pica, rumination disorder, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. So we know pica is when people will eat things or try and consume things that aren't edible or food, right? And so I have nibbling at non-food items. So the N is for non-suicidal self-injury, an A for anorexia nervosa, an N for non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors and personality disorders, and F is for factitious disorder. So let's look at rumination disorder. Remember that people with rumination disorder typically will eat food and then bring it back up. They might spit it out. They might eat it again. But for this, I have binging and gagging. So the B is for bulimia nervosa, an A for anorexia nervosa, and a G for gastrointestinal conditions. So with avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, we typically have patients who just don't eat, right? It's very like they avoid it and it's kind of restricted, right? And it's just like either like their appetite or like a sensory perception thing that makes them not want to eat, and they will typically have to compensate for that with like supplements or things like that, right? So I have avoiding and restricting food pattern over appetite or sensation that makes one solicit oral supplements. So we have an A for autism spectrum disorder, an R for reactive attachment disorder, an F for factitious disorder, a P for psychotic disorders, an O for other medical conditions, another A for anorexia nervosa, an S for specific phobia, an M for major depressive disorder, another O for obsessive compulsive disorder, another S for anxiety disorder, another O for other anxiety disorders, and another S for specific neurological or neuromuscular, structural or congenital disorders and conditions associated with feeding difficulties. So let's look at anorexia nervosa. This is a disorder that's characterized by like not taking in enough calories or not taking in many calories at all in order to maintain a very slim frame and body, right? And it becomes obsessive in a way. So we have obsessing about a slim body by managing, suspending, and stopping meals. So the O is for obsessive compulsive disorder. We have an A for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. The first S is for schizophrenia. We have a B for body dysmorphic disorder. There's another B for bulimia nervosa, an M for medical conditions, another S for substance use disorder. The last S is for social anxiety disorder, and there is another M that's for major depressive disorder. Now let's look at bulimia nervosa. We know that this disorder is characterized by binging and eating a whole bunch, right? And then kind of expelling those calories some type of way or trying to, right? And so people usually will like throw up or take diuretics or laxatives or even work out really hard for excessive amounts of time. So I have many binges and barfing or kinesthetics. So for the first, or for the M, we have major depressive disorder. The B is for binge eating disorder. And A, anorexia nervosa. B, borderline personality disorder. And K is Klein-Levin syndrome. Let's look at binge eating disorder now. Remember that binge eating disorder, it includes people who struggle and they eat like a lot, almost kind of uncontrollably. and there's a lot of guilt associated with it, and they sometimes will hide it, and things like that. So with that lack of discipline and just like feeling guilty and all that, I have binging, barring discipline, and bearing onus. So the first B is for bulimia nervosa. The next B is for bipolar disorder. The D is for depressive disorders. The B is for borderline personality disorders, and we have an O for obesity. So now let's jump on over into personality disorders. We're going to look at paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So remember that paranoid personality disorder is when someone just is super like paranoid, and it kind of it takes over, like it's a personality disorder, so it's like deep rooted within like who you are, right? And so I have paranoia spanning over one's persona. And so the P is for paranoid traits associated with physical handicaps. The S is for substance use disorders. We have an O for personality disorders and other personality traits, and an O for other mental disorders with psychotic symptoms, and lastly, a P for personality change due to another medical condition. Let's look at schizoid personality disorder now. Keep in mind that these are people who typically don't want to be around other people, or deal with other people's stuff, right? And sometimes they're a little odd, but I mean, they just kind of prefer to be by themselves. They avoid other people. And this is like long-term personality stuff. So we have preferring solitude over activities with others. So the P is for personality changes due to another medical condition. The S is for substance use disorders. The first O is for other personality disorders and personality traits. And A is for autism spectrum disorders. And the last O is for other mental disorders with psychotic symptoms. Looking at schizotypal personality disorder, I want you guys to remember that these are kind of the eccentric people. They're kind of paranoid sometimes, can be very suspicious of others. And so it's like these magical beliefs and things like that, right? And so we have paranoid suspicions of others' nature. So for the P, we have personality change due to another medical condition. We have an S for substance use disorder. O for other personality disorders and personality traits. Another O for other mental disorders associated with psychotic symptoms. And lastly, an N for neurodevelopmental disorder. So let's look at antisocial personality disorder. An antisocial personality disorder is characterized by people really struggling with like empathy and their behaviors, and their interactions for others, and just others' human rights and things like that, right? And it's just the general consistent pattern of that throughout pretty much their life, starting at what, 15 at least. So we have struggling with behavior, compassion, and sensitivity for others. So the first S is for substance use disorder. There's a B for bipolar disorders, a C for criminal behavior not associated with a personality disorder, and another S for schizophrenia, an O for other personality disorders. Okay, let's look at borderline personality disorder. Remember that borderline personality disorder, it has like a wide range of like characteristics, right? And what you typically see is like a lot of irritability, instability, emotionally kind of everywhere, feeling super like dependent on other people, suicidal ideations. All those things kind of come along with borderline personality. So here I decided to say broad spectrum of instability and dependency problems with others. So the B is for bipolar disorders. There's an S for substance use disorders, an I for identity problems, a D for depressive disorders, and a P for personality change due to another medical condition. And lastly, an O for other personality disorders. So let's look at histrionic personality disorder. Keep in mind that histrionic personality disorder is when you see it when somebody has like a consistent personality of just constantly being center stage. They need that attention. They need to perform for other people, right? So to speak. So I have steady performing for others. The S is for substance use disorders. The P is for personality change due to another medical condition. The O is for other personality disorders and personality traits. So let's look at narcissistic personality disorder. These are people who they're better than everyone else, right? They're superior in a sense, and they need you to know it, right? And so the thing I used for this was massive superiority over other humans. So the M is for mania, the S is for substance use disorder, there's an O for other personality disorders and personality traits, and then the H is for hypermania. So here we have avoidant personality disorder. And this is when people will typically avoid situations. It's not that they don't want to be involved in them, but they don't want the people to look at them and give them like a negative evaluation. They don't necessarily think that they can maintain in those environments and things like that. And so they typically avoid interactions with other people and in situations that are going to kind of force them into that. So I have opposed to subpar assessments. And there is an O for other personality disorders and personality traits, an S for substance use disorders, a P for personality change due to another medical condition, and an A for anxiety disorders. So let's launch into dependent personality disorder. Remember that people with this disorder, they show a lasting prevalence of just becoming really dependent upon other people, whether that's their parents, their partners, whoever. But it's almost kind of obsessive in a sense, like they just struggle functioning, and it's debilitating. So I have obsessively sprung on people. The first O is for other personality disorders and personality traits. The S is for substance use disorders. The other O is for other mental disorders and other medical conditions. And finally, we have a P for personality change due to another medical condition. So with the next one, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, we're looking at people who are really into like order and making sure everything is like just where it's supposed to be perfect. Everything's in order. And this is in all domains. It's not just in one place. So I have orderly perfectionism at home, school, and the office. So we have an O for obsessive compulsive disorder, P for personality change due to another medical condition, H for hoarding disorder, an S for substance use disorder, an O for other personality disorders and personality traits. Alrighty, we're getting down to it. Let's look at some neurodevelopmental disorders. So we'll look at intellectual disability, language disorder, speech down disorder, childhood onset fluency disorder, social communication disorder, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, specific learning disorder, stereotypic movement disorder, tic disorders. So first we're going to look at intellectual disability. Keep in mind that this is when people will typically have like very low assessments and low level functioning kind of across the board, right? So we have cognitive assessments measure mentally shallow. So the C is for communication disorder. We have an A for autism spectrum disorder, an M for major neurocognitive disorder, and another M for mild neurocognitive disorder, and an S for specific learning disorder. We also have language disorder, and this is characterized by people not necessarily having like the ability to either come up with or produce language in the way that we would expect, right? And so I have not having natural language ingenuity. Okay. The N is for normal variations in language. The H is for hearing or sensory impairment. There's another N for neurological disorders, an L for language regression, and an I for intellectual disability. Alrighty, so let's look at speech sound disorder. This is when people are consistently having issues with like their speech and sound formation and production and things like that, and it interferes with their speech and even like communication, right? And so I have difficulty navigating speech and hearing sounds. So the D is for dysarthria. The N is for normative variations in speech. There's an S for structural deficits, an H for hearing or other sensory impairment, and another S for selective mutism. Let's take a second look at childhood onset fluency disorder, also known as stuttering. We know that stuttering happens, and one of the things that we see with it is anxiety. That it makes it worse sometimes, right? So we have anxiety and nerves making stuttering terrible. So the A is for adult onset dysfluencies. The N is for normal speech dysfluencies. The M is for medication side effects. The S is for sensory deficits. And there's a T for Tourette syndrome. Okay, let's look at social communication disorder. This is when people will struggle with pragmatics, right, in socializing in order to get their needs met verbally, right? And so oftentimes it's very awkward communicating and like deeper than just people with issues with small talk, right? So I have general awkward aura in socializing. The G is for genetic and physiological. The A is for autism spectrum disorder. We have another A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, an I for intellectual disability, and last, an S for social anxiety disorder. Okay, so let's go over autism spectrum disorder. We know that this disorder is when people typically have a little bit of trouble with understanding those nuances with like communication and social interactions, and it's also like with we see a lot of like stimulating behaviors like flapping or repeating the same things or being fixated on things as well. A lot of consistency and things like that. So we have repeating the same stimulating stuff in limited social interactions. So the R is for Rett syndrome. The S is selective mutism. There's another S for schizophrenia, another S for social communication disorder, an A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, an L for language disorder, an S for stereotypic movement disorder, and an I for intellectual disability. All right, let's look at attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And keep in mind that this disorder is characterized by people really like struggling, whether it's fidgeting or paying attention or even just being impulsive in the moment. And this typically will happen in multiple settings around different types of people. And so I have struggling in multiple settings or around numerous people, redirecting impulses, paying attention, or delaying movements. So we have an S for specific learning disorder, an I for intermittent explosive disorder, an M for mood disorders, an S for substance use disorders, an O for neurodevelopmental disorders, an A for autism spectrum disorders, an N for neurocognitive disorder, a P for personality disorders, a R for reactive attachment disorders, an I for intellectual disabilities, a P for psychotic disorders, another A for anxiety disorders, an O for oppositional defiant disorders, a D for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and lastly, another M for medication-induced symptoms of ADHD. Okay, let's jump into specific learning disorder. This is characterized when people have issues with learning, like reading, writing, arithmetic, and it kind of goes against what's expected of them in a sense that like there are either cultural expectations or educational level or age level or whatever they've kind of been exposed to, right? So it kind of goes against what would be expected of them. So I have problems with learning abilities that negate normative interpretations. So the P is for psychotic disorders. The L is for learning difficulties due to neurological or sensory disorders. There's an A for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. An N for normative variations in academic attainment. There's another N for neurocognitive disorders. There's an I for intellectual disability. Okay, let's look at stereotypic movement disorder. Remember that this is when people typically, especially like in little kids, they'll have like some type of purposeless movements and things like that. It's repetitive and it seems driven, but it's not, right? And it'll typically be in the same areas over and over again, whether it's like head banging or waving, shaking, something like that, right? So we have obligation to act needlessly often. So the O is for obsessive compulsive related disorders. The T is for tic disorders. The A is for autism spectrum disorder. The N is for normative development. There's an O for other neurological and medical conditions. Whew. And finally, we reach tic disorders. And these are characterized by someone having like vocal tics or producing sounds that they can't necessarily control, usually very repetitive and things like that. Also, people might also have like motor tics or movements and things like that. And sometimes it's even both. And they can't necessarily control these things, right? Like they keep happening, they're repetitive. And so here I have someone moving around often with sounds. So the first S is for stereotypic movement disorder. There's also an M for myoclonus. There's an A for abnormal movements that may accompany other conditions. There's an O for obsessive compulsive and related disorders. And there's another S for substance-induced and paroxysmal dyskinesias. So I hope that this video has helped you guys in the way that it's helped me. And yeah, enjoy.